The warning had been there for 2,000 years. It was carved into the surface of 17 dead moons, spread across 4 star systems at the edge of explored space. The words were written in a language so old that only 3 beings in the known galaxy could read it without a translation machine. Thresh was one of them. Thresh had read the warning so many times that the words had stopped feeling like words. They felt like breathing, like a thing the body does without being told. That morning, in the Great Hall of the Galactic Conclave, Thresh watched a young species discover the warning for the first time, and decide it did not apply to them. The Velshari High Caller's name was Sarath Ven. He stood at the center of the chamber, with the posture of a man who had never been wrong about anything important. He was tall, pale-scaled, with 4 eyes arranged in a wide arc across his face, a feature that gave his species near-perfect peripheral vision, though it had never helped them see what was coming. He had maps, big, beautiful maps projected into the air above the chamber floor. His home systems glowed gold, Conclave territory glowed blue, and there, at the edge of everything, was a region with no color at all, a blank, a hole in the known universe, ringed with a faint red border that meant, in every cartographic system ever developed by every spacefaring species, do not enter, reason on file. Sarath then pointed at the blank space. Unclaimed territory, he said, 12 habitable worlds, 17 resource-rich moons, and no registered owner. The chamber was quiet, the quiet of a room full of very old beings who were trying to decide whether to explain something to someone who would not listen or simply let the lesson happen. Thresh had been in this room for 400 years. They knew this quiet well. It was the quiet that came before catastrophe, the way a certain stillness comes before a storm, the air going heavy, the birds going silent, every living thing in the world pausing for one breath before everything changes. The more delicate, so old their species had no record of a time before them, stood up. They did not speak. They folded their 4 secondary arms flat against their body, a gesture in their culture that meant something between mourning and farewell. Then they walked out of the chamber. Sarath Ven watched them go. He seemed to take it as a point in his favor. Thresh stayed. Someone always had to watch. After the session, Thresh took Sarath Ven to the archive. It was deep below the conclave building, carved into the bedrock of the station itself. The lights were low, and the air was cool, and everything in the archive was very, very old. Thresh moved through it without hesitation. They knew every shelf, every file, every image burned into every storage crystal. They had spent a long time down here. They found the record and opened it. The translation appeared in the air between them, rendered in the Velshari reading script, so there would be no misunderstanding. They are not dangerous because they are strong. They are dangerous because they do not stop. Below it, a second line, written in a different hand, a later edition, added by someone who had seen something the first writer had only anticipated. We made contact. We will not make contact again. This is not a suggestion. Sarath Ven read it. He read it again. Then he looked at Thresh with those 4 wide eyes and said, "This was written by something that feared them." Thresh said nothing. "Fear," Sarath Ven continued, "is not evidence. Fear is a reaction. A small species fears a larger species. A prey animal fears a predator. Fear tells us about the one who feels it, not about the thing they are afraid of." He gestured at the words floating in the air. Whoever wrote this was afraid. That is all we know. Thresh thought of 17 dead moons, thought of the labor involved, the ships, the tools, the time it would take to carve a warning into the surface of 17 celestial bodies. Thought about what kind of fear drives a species to that. Not the sharp fear of being chased, the deep fear of the thing you barely survived. The fear that gets passed down to your children because you need them to understand that you are not being dramatic. Would you like to see the source image? Thresh asked. Not the translation, the original. Sareth Ven said yes. Thresh pulled it up. It was a moon, or it had been. The image was taken from orbit, the whole surface visible, and across that surface, carved so deep, the grooves created shadows visible from space, were the words. But Thresh wasn't looking at the words. Not this time. They were looking at what was around the words, the shape of the moon itself, the way the continents had been, not eroded, not impacted, shaped, deliberately. The entire surface geography had been reworked, not carved on, carved into. The geography itself had been used as a canvas. This was a planet, Thresh said. Sareth then looked at the image. At some point, Thresh continued, someone converted an entire planet into a written warning. They compressed it, they reshaped it, they turned a world into a message. A pause. Whoever wrote this was not afraid. They were thorough. The silence this time was different. Thresh watched the high caller's face and saw something move through it. Some small, honest uncertainty, and then watched it be put away, filed somewhere dark. The door closed. The Velshari, Sareth Ven said, have never retreated from territory because of a wall carving. Thresh nodded. They had expected this. Expecting it did not make it easier. The conclave voted the following morning. A delegation would be sent to the blank space on the map, to Earth, which was what the beings inside the quarantine zone called their homeworld, to explain the situation, to negotiate, to warn the Velshari fleet to turn back. The delegation departed at midday. Sareth Ven's fleet had departed the night before. Thresh went back to the archive alone, not to read the warning again. They had read it enough. They went back to look at the image, the moon that had been a planet, the carved-in words, the evidence of a species that had turned a world into a sentence, because they needed to be absolutely certain the message would last. Thresh looked at the image for a long time. Then, they looked at the area around the carved moon, the surrounding space, the orbital distance, the angle. The planet hadn't just been carved, it had been positioned, placed in a specific orbital lane, the lane that any species expanding outward from that region of space would inevitably pass through in their first century of exploration. It had been put there like a sign at the entrance to a road. Thresh sat with that. Somewhere far away, across the dark between stars, a fleet of beautiful ships was sailing toward a very old silence, the silence that comes before everything changes. The fleet came out of fold space like something meant to be looked at. 412 ships, each one built in the Velshari tradition, long, curved hulls that looked grown rather than constructed, plated in living biological armor that shimmered between green and black, depending on the angle of the light. Their weapons arrays ran along the dorsal spine of each ship like a row of lanterns, bioluminescent, pulsing slowly when idle. When they fired, they looked like the aurora over a gas giant. Sareth Ven had always thought they were the most beautiful things his civilization had ever made. He stood at the observation window of the command ship and looked out at the star system ahead of them. It was quieter than he expected. He had studied what little the Conclave archives held about this region. A single inhabited world, third from its star, one large moon, several smaller bodies used, according to old and vague records, for resource extraction. A species that had achieved spaceflight approximately 300 years ago, and had not, according to every piece of data available, expanded beyond their own system in any significant way. A contained species, a local species, a species that had, for reasons the archives did not explain clearly, been placed under quarantine by a conclave vote so old that none of the beings who cast it were still alive. The system ahead looked exactly like what he expected. Quiet, underdeveloped, a civilization that had not yet learned to reach. No defensive perimeter detected, his tactical officer said. Her name was Vireth, and she had been with him for 11 years. She had a habit of reading sensor data more than once before she spoke, which he had always considered a virtue. She was reading it again now. No fleet presence in outer system, she continued. No active weapon signatures. No targeting locks. A pause. No response on any known frequency. Sereth then considered this. They see us? Their sensor technology would detect us, yes. At this range, certainly. Then they have chosen not to respond. Vireth looked at her screen. That would be one explanation. He did not ask her what the other explanations were. He was the high caller. He made the determinations. They are afraid, he said. A small civilization, alone in their system, watching 400 ships arrive at their border. Fear is a rational response. Vireth said nothing. The fleet advanced. Mars Station hailed them 40 minutes later. It was a structure in orbit around the system's fourth planet. Red, barren, cold. And it was smaller than Sereth then expected. Old design, functional rather than elegant. The communication channel opened. A man, older, with gray at his temples and a face that had spent a long time outdoors on a world with a strong sun. He was in a dark uniform with no decorations that Sereth Ven's translation system could identify as rank indicators. He was holding a cup of something hot. Steam rose from it. He was drinking it. In this moment. With 400 ships visible through whatever window was behind him. He was drinking something warm from a cup, and looking at them with an expression that Sereth Ven's cultural translation matrix could only categorize, after a long processing pause, as patient. The man spoke. The translation system worked through 17 languages in sequence. The Velshari did not know which language this species used, so the system tried them all, and the human waited through each one, without impatience, as though he had time. The 17th language hit. The words resolved. This is Mars Station Actual. Please identify your fleet, your point of origin, and your intentions in this system. Sereth Ven delivered the Velshari Declaration. It was a formal document, 3 minutes long, composed by his government's finest legal and diplomatic minds. It stated, with grace and precision, that the Velshari people were filing a claim of territorial absorption over this system, on the basis that it existed outside any registered conclave boundary, and had no active interstellar governance body representing it. It offered generously a period of transition. It promised that the current inhabitants would be treated with the dignity owed to any pre-expansion civilization. It was, he believed, a fair document. The human on the screen listened to all 3 minutes of it. He did not interrupt, he did not react, visibly. When it ended, he looked at Sereth Ven for a moment, then looked briefly off to the side, consulting someone else in the room perhaps, and then looked back. He said, "Copy that. Stand by." The channel closed. Sereth Ven waited. 8 minutes passed. No response came. He ordered the first strike. The weapons arrays lit up the dark, beautiful, exactly as they always were, cascading light that rolled down the spine of each ship and burst outward in long arcs of color. 3 orbital platforms above the blue and white world. A refueling structure near the 4th planet. They hit all 4 targets. Then Vireth said, very quietly, the platforms were unmanned. Sereth Ven looked at her. All 4 targets, she said. No life signs detected, pre-strike or post. The platforms were empty. The refueling depot had been decommissioned. Estimated time since decommission, between 3 and 5 weeks. The fleet advanced toward the 3rd planet. The human ships did not come from the planet. They came from everywhere else. From behind the large moon. From the asteroid belt between the 4th and 5th planets. From positions tucked behind the system's smaller bodies. Dark and cold and invisible to the initial scan, because they were running no active systems, no engines, no weapons, no signals. Just sitting in the dark, waiting, with the patience of something that had decided long ago that the question was never whether, but when. 412 Velshari ships, 207 human vessels, smaller than his, less beautiful, gray and angular and ugly in the straightforward way that tools are ugly. Vireth read the sensor data 3 times. "They're pre-positioning," she said. "I'm calculating the earliest possible date they could have taken these positions, based on thermal residue and micro-debris drift." Her voice stayed level. "Minimum 3 weeks ago, sir. Before the fleet left Velshari space. Before the declaration had even been drafted. The first human weapon did not look like anything. There was no light, no sound in the vacuum. One moment a cathedral-class Velshari warship existed. 11 years of construction, 1,000 crew, living hull plating that had taken decades to grow, and the next moment it did not. No explosion, no debris. The space where it had been was simply empty, slightly distorted, the way air looks above hot ground. Sareth Ven stared at the empty space. His fleet was already moving, already returning fire, the aurora light of 400 weapons arrays painting the dark between planets. The battle was real, and it was loud, and it was being managed by capable officers who knew their work. Sareth Ven kept looking at the empty space. The branch that does not yield breaks. He had said that. About them. About this species and their quiet little system, with their unmanned platforms and their decommissioned depot, and their ugly gray ships that had been sitting in the dark for 3 weeks, waiting, with the patience of something that already knew how this worked. He understood now that he had been using the saying wrong. He had thought he was the gardener. He was the branch. They came for her on a Tuesday. She was in her garden in Oaxaca, doing nothing important, pulling weeds from between tomato plants. The sun was doing what the Oaxacan sun always did, pressing down with both hands. And she was sweating, and her knees hurt, and she had a cup of coffee sitting on the low stone wall beside her that had gone cold an hour ago. She was 61 years old. She had retired 4 years ago. She had told herself she was done. The 2 officers who came down the dirt path to her garden were young and uncomfortable in the heat. They stopped at the edge of the plot. The taller one opened his mouth to speak. "I know why you're here," Admiral Rhea Vasquez said. She didn't look up from the weeds. "Give me 5 minutes." She finished the row, drank the cold coffee, pulled off her gloves. She did not ask why her. She already knew. There were other admirals, younger, newer, with more recent command hours. But there was only one admiral who had spent 15 years running the math on exactly this scenario. Only one who had written the doctrine. Only one who had stood in front of a unified command review board after the Io incident, and told them, clearly, what would eventually happen and what it would take to stop it, and had watched them file the report under a classification level no one would open unless the situation became unavoidable. The situation had become unavoidable. She took one look back at her garden. The tomatoes were going to need water by Thursday. She left with the officers. The war room was underground, 7 levels below the Pacific Fleet headquarters building, in a city that didn't officially exist on any public map. It was cold and bright and full of people who had not slept recently. Every screen showed something different. Fleet positions, casualty numbers, engagement data from the outer system, Velshari ship schematics that analysts were still working to fully understand. Her new staff lined up when she walked in. 8 officers, ranging from 26 to 43. They all looked at her with the expression people get when they need someone to tell them things are going to be manageable. She didn't tell them that. She wasn't going to start a command with a lie. "Run the math," she said, "on everything. I want numbers, not feelings, not guesses, not what you hope is true. Numbers." They ran the math. The Velshari fleet was 412 ships strong. Current engagements in the outer system had reduced that number to 388. Human losses stood at 41 ships. The Velshari weapons technology was sophisticated, and their ships were well built. Their tactical response time was slower than expected. They were good at executing prepared plans, less good at adapting when the plan failed. "They've never fought a war they didn't start," her second-in-command said. His name was Commander Dela Cruz, 38, formerly of the Titan Division. He was good at the kind of thinking that didn't stop at the obvious answer. Every engagement in their history, they had the element of surprise. They don't have doctrine for the other situation. "We do," Vasquez said. She pulled up the document on the central screen. Threshold response. Classified at a level that had required 3 separate authorization codes to access, even for her. She had written it 9 years ago, after the I.O. incident, when Command had finally decided that the math she'd been doing privately needed to be formalized. She watched her staff read it, watched them work through the 3 provisions, watched them slow down at Provision 3. "There is no ceiling on response." The room was quiet. "I didn't say I was happy about it," Vasquez said. "I said, run the math." The math said this: the Velshari home systems were 16 light weeks from Earth. Their fleet, engaged and taking losses in the outer system, could not be reinforced in under 2 months. Their command structure was centralized. Everything flowed through Serath Ven, which was an elegant arrangement in peacetime and a brittleness in war. If the fleet in this system was removed, the Velshari capacity to project force into human space dropped to approximately nothing. For approximately 8 months, after which they would rebuild, rearm, and try again. Possibly with a larger fleet, possibly with better information, possibly having learned from the parts that didn't work. History was full of that pattern. She had the data going back 300 years. "If we stop at our own border," she told Dela Cruz, "we're just delaying this for the next admiral." Dela Cruz looked at her. "You're talking about following them home. I'm talking about finishing it." She held his gaze. "There's a difference." "Command approved this?" She held up the signed order. She had signed it herself, under the authority of Threshold Response Provision 3, which gave the Fleet Admiral operational autonomy in the event of a direct attack on human territorial space. The legal framework was airtight. She had written the legal framework too. Dela Cruz looked at the order, then at her, then back at the screen. "Run the math," he said quietly. Not to her, to himself. "Yes," she said. They pushed. What had started as a defensive engagement in the outer system became something else. A systematic, methodical dismantling of the Velshari fleet, position by position. Drawing them back, not letting them consolidate, not letting them find the stable defensive formation their doctrine called for. Her ships were smaller and uglier, and some of them were old enough that their engines needed attention between engagements. She ran them hard anyway. 3 weeks in, they took a Velshari ship intact. It was a cruiser class, mid-size, roughly equivalent to one of her destroyer tonnage vessels. The crew had survived. 64 beings, scaled and 4-eyed, in surprisingly good health. Her medical teams worked carefully. Her translation teams worked faster. The debrief reports came back on a Thursday morning. She read them over coffee, standing at the desk in her temporary quarters. The reports were thorough. Her intelligence people were good. The Velshari crew, to a person, had not known humanity existed before this campaign. Not in any meaningful way. The quarantine had been so total, maintained so carefully for so long, that no information about the species inside it had reached Velshari education, media, or public record. Serath then had found a blank space on a conclave map. He had not found a warning and ignored it. He had found a blank space and seen real estate. He genuinely had not known. Vasquez read the report to the end, set it down, picked up her coffee, drank it, "Doesn't change the math," she said. She was alone in the room when she said it, which was the only reason she let the next 4 seconds happen. The 4 seconds where she sat with what she just said, and what it meant, and what kind of person says it, and means it. Then she put the cup down and went back to the war room. The math did not care about what anyone knew or didn't know. The math was just what happened if you ran the numbers honestly and followed them to the end. She had been running numbers her whole career. She had never found one that got easier by looking away. Sareth then came back to the conclave alone. No fleet, no delegates, no legal team with their careful documents and formal language. He came on a single ship, a small one, and he sat in the passenger cabin for the entire journey without sleeping. He looked at nothing in particular. He had the face of a man working through a problem that kept changing its shape every time he got close to solving it. The war was not going well. 3 of his 7 home systems were under human blockade. The fleet he had taken into human space had been reduced to fragments. Some ships destroyed, some retreating, some simply gone in the way that first ship had gone, without debris or fire, just an absence where something had been. His admirals were sending him plans that all had the same flaw. They assumed the humans would eventually stop. Nothing in the data suggested that was true. He arrived at the conclave station and went directly to the archive. Not to the chamber, not to make arguments or file documents or ask for intervention. He went to the archive because there was something he needed to understand, and the archive was the only place that might help him understand it. Thresh was there. They were always there. Sareth then stood in the doorway of the deep archive room and looked at the old being sitting at the far end, surrounded by storage crystals and the faint blue light of open records. He did not say, "Why didn't you stop me?" He had been thinking that question for 3 weeks, and he had already worked out that it was the wrong question. "What did you know?" he asked. "Tell me everything." Then they began. They told him about the 2,000-year-old event. A species, now extinct, that had made contact with humanity before the quarantine was formally established. What had happened after? How long it had taken? The fact that the species in question had been, at the time, the 3rd most powerful civilization in the known galaxy, and had entered the conflict with every advantage of size, technology, and preparation. They told him about the Io incident. Not the version in the public record, which said almost nothing, but the full archive version that Thresh had spent 4 years compiling from fragments and partial reports, and the testimony of 3 surviving conclave observers. There had been a provocation. A human installation had been attacked by a species acting in disputed territory. The humans had responded, and the response had been governed by a doctrine that had no upper limit. And by the time both sides agreed to stop, the attacking species had lost 6 of their 14 inhabited worlds. Not destroyed, not killed, blockaded, pressured, systematically dismantled, and then released, with the understanding, apparently communicated in very plain language, that if there was a next time, there would not be a stopping point. There had not been a next time. The species in question now shared conclave resources peacefully, and did not discuss the Io incident in public. Sareth then sat with this. "The quarantine," he said, "it was not because they are a danger to themselves." "No," Thresh said, "it was to protect everyone else from provoking them." "Yes, and no one told us." Thresh was quiet for a moment. The quarantine worked by not explaining itself. A border with a reason is a border that invites debate. A blank space on a map is a blank space. Most species see it and move on. Pause. You were curious. Sareth then thought about that, about the chamber, about his beautiful maps, about the blank space he had pointed at with such confidence. "I thought fear was not evidence," he said. Pause. "Fear is always evidence," Thresh said. "The question is what it is evidence of." Pause. He left the archive and went to the small communications room the conclave maintained for private diplomatic contact. He sat in front of the console for a long time, before he started writing. He did not write a request for terms. He had nothing to offer in terms. He did not write a formal apology from his government, because his government had not authorized him to do this, and he had stopped caring about that approximately 2 weeks ago when he watched the casualty numbers reach a point his mind refused to process as real. He had her name from the intelligence his fleet had gathered in the early days of the engagement, before the intelligence apparatus had been largely destroyed along with the ships it was attached to. He told her the Velshari were withdrawing all territorial claims, unconditionally. Every legal document, every filed claim, every procedural motion his government had entered with the conclave, withdrawn. He wrote this clearly so there would be no confusion. Then he sat and looked at the screen. He wrote, "I have read the full record of what your people did at Io. I understand now what I did not understand when I looked at a map and saw an empty space. I am sending you this message, not because I believe it will stop anything. I am sending it because you should know that I understand." He looked at that for a while. He deleted it. He wrote it again, shorter. "I have read the IO files. I understand now what I should have understood before I began this. I am sending you the unconditional withdrawal of all Velshari territorial claims. I ask only that you leave us our star." He read it again. He added one line, "I am sorry." He sent it. Then he sat in the quiet communications room and thought about the star he had asked her to leave them. The sun that his people had lived under for all of their history. The light that fell on the cities where his family lived, where the academies were that he had attended, where the shipyards were that had built the beautiful ships he had taken into human space. In the Velshari tradition, the sun was considered a living thing, not in a metaphorical way, literally. It was believed to have awareness, in the way that very large and very old things accumulate awareness without meaning to. The sun watched over them. He looked at the ceiling of the small room. He hoped she would say yes. Vasquez received the message on a Friday. She was in the war room. She read it at her desk, standing up, the way she read most things. She read it once, then she read the last 3 lines again. She had already made the decision about the star 6 days ago. The stellar weapon, a device her engineers had built in 8 months, which was not the fastest they had ever built something, but was close, had been armed and fired 4 days ago. It would reach the Velshari home star in another 3 days. It would not destroy the star. It would not harm the planets around it, or the people on them. It would scar the star's outer fusion layer in a way that would be visible from the surface. The scar would last approximately 10,000 years. Long enough for the lesson to be part of every generation of Velshari that would ever look up. She had made the decision before his message. He was asking for something she had already decided not to give him, without knowing she had decided, and without knowing it was already too late. She set the message down. She picked up her coffee. He had said, "I am sorry." She believed him. She was a good judge of honesty, and the message read like honesty. Not the performed honesty of diplomacy, but the plain honesty of a man who had run out of anything else. She drank her coffee. She did not send a reply. There was nothing to say that the math had not already said. There was nothing to do that had not already been done. She had run the numbers, and she had followed them to the end, as she always did. And the end was a scar on a star, and a message left in the sky for 10,000 years. She was not happy about it. She had never said she would be. Thresh did the counting because no one else was going to do it honestly. Every other record that came out of the conflict had a purpose behind it. The Velshari records were written to minimize. The human records were written to justify. The Conclave's official summary was written to avoid assigning blame to the institution that had watched everything happen from a comfortable distance and done nothing useful in time. Thresh had no purpose except accuracy. So, They counted. Velshari dead. The number the Velshari government released publicly was smaller than the number Thresh calculated from fleet records, population displacement data, and the detailed engagement logs that the human fleet had filed with precise, almost administrative thoroughness. The difference between the two numbers was large enough to matter. Thresh recorded both and noted the gap, and did not speculate about which was true in print, because they knew which was true, and speculation would have been dishonest. Human dead, 2,214,611. That number was exact. The humans had been exact about it. Every name on a list somewhere, Thresh suspected. The kind of species that kept lists of names. That made a certain sense. If you're the kind of species that fights without a ceiling, keeping exact count of what it costs you is how you stay honest about what you are doing. Thresh sat with both numbers for a long time, tried to decide which was the tragedy and which was the lesson. Decided that was a stupid way to think about it. Both were both. A tragedy is still a lesson, and a lesson is always a tragedy. And pretending otherwise was the kind of comfortable thinking that led to situations like this one in the first place. They filed the count in the archive and closed the record. Vasquez came to the conclave 6 weeks after the ceasefire. She came alone. No uniform, no escort, no fleet in orbit above the station. She wore plain dark clothes and carried a bag that looked like it had been with her for many years. She had the look of someone who had slept badly for a long time and had accepted that as the new condition. The conclave chamber received her with a full session. Every seat was filled. Even the Moor delegate had returned, folding themselves into the seat they had abandoned. The day Seraph then had pointed at his maps and called silence an opportunity. The senior delegate asked her, with formal courtesy, what humanity wanted from the conclave going forward. Vasquez looked at the room. Nothing, she said. The room was quiet. We handled it, she said. We don't need anything from you. She let that sit for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and put a data chip on the table in front of her. Small, simple, the kind used for basic file transfer. That's our full after-action record. Every engagement, every decision point, everything threshold response authorized and why. She pushed it forward slightly. For the archive, so it's accurate. She picked up her bag. One thing, she said. She did not say it loudly, or with any particular emphasis, the way someone says something they have been thinking about for a long time and have decided to keep short. Next time one of your members finds a quarantine zone on an old map, maybe don't send your delegation 6 hours after their fleet. She left. The chamber stayed quiet for longer than usual after she was gone. The Moor delegate, who had not spoken since they returned, said 4 words in their own language. The translation came through a beat later. She is not wrong. Nobody argued. The vote came 3 days later. Not about humanity, about the zone itself, and about warnings, and about what had been learned, if anything had been learned, from the fact that a 2,000-year-old warning, carved into 17 moons, at extraordinary effort, by a species that had understood the problem very clearly, had ultimately failed to prevent the very thing it was warning against. The debate was long. Thresh listened to all of it. The core problem was simple. The old warning had failed, not because it was unclear, but because the being who read it had decided that fear was not evidence. The warning had been written from a place of fear, and so a confident being had dismissed it. Any new warning that sounded afraid would face the same problem. Thresh asked to speak. They rarely asked to speak. The room gave them the floor immediately. The old warning explained what humanity is, Thresh said. It described a characteristic. It said they do not stop. That is a true statement, and an insufficient one, because a sufficiently confident reader will decide that all species believe that about themselves, and that the writer was simply inexperienced. A pause. The new warning should not describe humanity. It should describe what happened to the last species that ignored the old one. A pause. The chamber considered this. "You are describing a record," the senior delegate said, "not a warning." "I am describing both," Thresh said, at the same time. They found a moon, dead, airless, stable, in the high-traffic stellar lane that any species expanding outward from the inner arm would pass through in their first century of spaceflight. Close enough to see clearly from a passing ship. Far enough from any system that no one would settle it and build over it. It had been a planet once, long ago, before something large had impacted it and broken it down to this smaller remnant. Thresh found this appropriate, without being able to fully explain why. The carving took 3 months. Thresh oversaw it personally, reviewing each section before the crews moved to the next. They were thorough, in the way the original carvers had been thorough. The grooves deep enough to cast shadows visible from orbit. The positioning calculated so that the carved face caught direct stellar light at the angle most ships would approach from. On the last day, when it was finished, Thresh put on a pressure suit and walked out onto the surface. It was very still. No air, no sound, no movement of any kind. Just the gray-white rock under their feet, and the finished carving stretching away in both directions, and the stars above, and one star among them that now had a scar on it that would be there for 10,000 years. Thresh looked at the carving. A factual account written in the 12 most common trade languages of the Galactic Arm, with translation keys provided for the 12 most likely languages after that. It described what had happened. It described the timeline. It described the exact nature of the human response. It described with precise numbers what it had cost the species that had decided a blank space on a map was an opportunity. At the bottom below the record were 3 words. Not a threat, not a plea. 3 words that were simply true, and that any reader would understand immediately, regardless of cultural context. Because they described a fact about the universe that every spacefaring species eventually discovered was true of things much older than themselves. Thresh read them in the silence of the airless moon. They had spent 2,000 years in the archive. They had read every record, filed every document, watched every event from behind the careful distance of observation. They had told themselves that watching was a form of contribution, that keeping accurate records was a kind of responsibility, that if they observed carefully enough and documented thoroughly enough, the information would eventually be useful to someone. They had sent a delegation 6 hours late. They stood on the moon, and they thought about witness and cowardice, and whether there was actually a difference between the two when the outcome was the same. They did not resolve the question. They suspected they never would. Above them, the stars were very bright and very far away. One of them was burning differently than it had burned before. A small change, barely perceptible at this distance, but it was there. It would be there for a long time. Thresh walked back to the ship. Behind them, in the silence and the starlight, the 3 words sat in the rock and waited for the next curious species to come and read them. They were patient words. They had time.